I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, Ambassador Dominique Struye from Belgium, the ambassador of the country of Belgium to the United States of America. It's a very important job. When you watch the European countries and who they select to go to different places, it's always a big clue when someone gets jobs like ambassador to Germany or perm rep at NATO or ambassador to the United States. And our guest today has held all three of those jobs. He was Belgian ambassador to Germany for almost 6 years during a very important time where a lot was going on in the European Union and in NATO. Perm rep to NATO for almost 5 years. These are longer than normal postings. Spent a good deal of time in the cabinet of a long-serving Belgian prime minister working on foreign affairs, was chef de cabinet for the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Belgium. Before that, going way back, spent the early part of his diplomatic career in Africa with postings in a number of African states, Zaire, Zimbabwe, I believe also Nigeria for a time. Before that, the ambassador was involved in higher education, just like you are right now. He was working first at the University in Leuven in his native Flemish part of Belgium, did a degree at UCL, University College London, and then spent also some time at the University in Ghent. We're delighted to have him here today. We've just come from meeting with a member of the Utah State Senate and then the MTC, where the ambassador remarked to me that it looked a lot like Catholic education in his day. Very disciplined, very rigid, and extremely organized.
Well organized.
Well organized. Well organized. His topic today is Belgium-U.S. relations, and after his formal presentations, he's happy to take questions on all things Belgian. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dominique Struye.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for so many students coming up to listen to an ambassador. And I'm delighted that you presented me in the right way, saying that I was the ambassador of the Kingdom of Belgium. Because recently in Washington, entering a club and being rather confused about all these small countries in Europe, I was presented, as the ambassador of the Republic of Brussels. So at least now I hope that everybody knows that the capital of Belgium is Brussels, and that probably two of the most important cities in the world at the moment are Washington and Brussels, because, when we listen to the news, it's always the news coming out of Washington within the Beltway, as we say, and Brussels, capital of Europe and capital of NATO. I heard that you speak many languages, so I was not invited to teach in French or in Dutch. I could have done it. But that you know a lot about Europe, so I'm first going to test your knowledge. I was not born in Brussels, but I was born in Ghent. Is Ghent very important for the United States? Has anybody an idea of Ghent has a relationship with the history of the United States? So you still have to teach a lot to these students,
I think I have to learn myself.
It's there where in 1814, the final peace treaty between the United States and the UK was signed. So I thought you may have known it. I see the one face who had a big smile and other things. So be sure that there is somewhere in Ghent a big plate referring to the United States. And as you were in a time of your history which was extremely important. I have decided not so much, to speak about the Belgium-US relations, but first of all, a little bit about Belgium, because some may have heard that at the moment we're going through a rather difficult period, and you may try to better understand Belgium by just not always looking at this, not dispute, but what is going on in the country, that it's much more than, let's say, a fight or an affirmation of the two cultural identities, Flemish and Walloon. So we had election on the 10th of June, and we still have today, let's say 150 days after the election, we have no government, and it looks as if we will have no government in the coming weeks, which may be surprising for a country as the United States, where the following day after the election, you know exactly who will be your president and probably who will be member of your government. What is going on in Belgium, is a whole evolution, and it is an evolution from a state who was, copied according to the French system, a very centralized government, into what is to become, a much more decentralized government. And you will better understanding when I refer to the United States, which means that originally all the powers were concentrated, with the central government. That means the central government was deciding about everything. Since a few years, due to the cultural diversity, there is a movement in order to decentralize the powers to the regions and the communities. The regions are deciding more about the economic issues. The communities are deciding more about everything which is related to culture and education. And now some people find that top-down decentralization is not the right system, and that we should change the whole system into a bottom-up federalism. A bottom-up federalism is not difficult to understand for the people living in the United States, where most of the powers, remain, within the competence of your states, and the states are delegating, some competences to the central government, mainly in issue, of finance, foreign policy, and defense. And that is what is going on in Belgium. We try, in fact, to bring the whole country upside down from a centralized type of government, who was slow in delegating some competences to the regions and communities, to move it into a bottom-up federalism in order, to the regions and community to decide what powers will remain within the central government. And that movement, is very, very difficult. And that is normal because, the two regions not being that powerful, and in fact, when I say two regions, there are three regions because Brussels, which has more and more become a Washington, D.C., Brussels, D.C. type, is also a region, are not that rich. And that would be the same if suddenly in the United States you would take one of the poorest states, and I don't know which state in the United States, one of the poor, compare with California or Texas, and you decide, to bring them either in a centralized type of government or in a more decentralized type of government. And that is what is going on in Belgium, and that takes some time for some to accept it and to make that movement. So what we want to become is more a type of United States of Belgium, and no more the centralized type of French type government where the central power has everything to decide. That by way of introduction. In fact, I had given, as title to my short intervention, how to face the challenges of the 21st century, unilateralism versus multilateralism. And that is, I think, one of the key problems between United States and Europe in a certain way, is how to run the world. And that is the question which you all are facing, in the coming year, and on which we have to find the right answers, another thing. Quite clearly, my starting point is quite clearly that 9/11, will be a milestone in human history, because it's a very symbolic date, and suddenly it was revealing a certain number of problems, which of course didn't all start on 9/11, but which were brought forward in a much more explicit way, with 9/11. So 9/11 will definitely be known, as the beginning of a new area. What are the contents of this new area? I think, it's definitely the image of globalization, but globalization in two different ways. We all accept globalization as a basic element of our future and of the evolution of the world, but the attacks of 9/11 are typically anti-globalization movement. That means you have a crystallization of two movements in 9/11, where the globalizing world is faced the anti-globalizing world, because the people who made this attack are the people who refuse the evolution of the world and want definitely to destroy that globalization movement. We also discover slowly a certain number of new challenges since 9/11, and it just mentioned more than before. I know you will never find exactly the date as 9/11, but the problems of energy supply, of environment, and even trade, globalized trade. And all these phenomena are the one which our government are facing at the moment, another thing. Once again, 9/11 brought forward more than before probably the problem of the clash of civilization. Quite clearly you felt that on that 9/11 we had different type of civilization having a different view of the world and projecting a different future of the world. And that was, revealed on 9/11 also. And also somewhere, if you speak of civilization, you see an increased influence of religions. Where the religions didn't play a great role in the 20th century, suddenly we feel a resurgence, of the religion influence. And all these phenomena somewhere, were brought more together, than originally before 9/11. But we have to realize that also at that stage, we are facing, a democratic challenge. Quite clearly, we are all convinced that we are somewhere the majority in the world, but we should always quite clearly realize, that Europe, with its 500 million inhabitants, if we take the 27 states, is only 7% of the world population. The United States, with its 300 million, less than 5% of the world population. So that is a problem which we are facing. So it's looking to this new world that we have to find out the new answer. And there, within the last years, we faced a big evolution. Let's say, the last time the world changed more fundamentally was after the Second World War, in my eyes. There we created a totally new world, which was mainly based, on the creation of a certain number of great multilateral institutions. That's why I start already with my title, That was the area where we created the United Nations, NATO, European Union, but also a large number of economic international organizations which are still highly influential, even if they're also facing the problem of their evolution and transformation, is the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and OECD. So that was a stage of the world where, after the Second World War, having had that confrontation between the free world, and the dictatorship, of Nazism, suddenly we discovered that multilateralism was probably the best solution to run the world in a good way. We were looking for a world, good governance, another thing, and we were all highly influenced, by that evolution. But after that, of course, the world changed relatively quickly because we entered that phase of confrontation between the Cold War and the free world led by the United States and the Soviet Union leading the communist world and other thing. But other phenomena were at least as important during this period and changed fundamentally the outlook of our world, and that was the high increase of number of states. Suddenly when we entered the United Nations in 1948-49, we were approximately 60 states. Now, as everybody knows, we have 192 states in the United Nations. So there are 3 times more states in the world at the moment than there were in 1960. A world of 190 states is totally different than a world with 60 states. And mainly, the increase of states were due to 2 main phenomena. First of all, the decolonization, which created within Africa and other continents, a high number of states, and then also the implosion of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, which increased suddenly, in Yugoslavia was 1 state, suddenly you had 7 states, and even probably sooner or later Kosovo will be added to that number. And also in the Soviet Union, the USSR was imploded and created, 7 or 8 new states. Probably I'm not a nice boy, and they want to cut me. But together with that, and that is a normal phenomenon, is that at the moment you create more states, there is a natural trend that some states take the lead, and we had definitely, already the emergence, especially after the fall of the Cold War, of the Berlin Wall, of one superpower, hyperpower as it was called, the United States. And that was the illusion at that stage, that we would be at the end of the history and that the world will be run, under the leadership of the only United States as guiding a nation in the world. And that phenomenon is a phenomenon which is now analyzed by many, many people, is the emergence, of the United States as only predominant superpower. But it's very strange if you look at the history of the United States, that the United States has not always had a natural tendency of being a world leader, and even if we take, the history of the United States, I'm not speaking because you're all Americans and you know your history much better than ourselves, but if we take, the slow emergence of the United States in world history, it was in the beginning a very reluctant decision to enter into history. If you take, and now you may be surprised that I will say that the 2 times you came to liberate Europe in 1917 and 1942-44, Europeans were thinking that you were coming too late. We were asking for you to come much earlier on the European soil to make an end, to the German predominance in Europe and to the Nazi dominance, and you were totally reluctant, It took you a long, long time to come into Europe to liberate, and to help liberate Belgium among other nations. That's a point of history you should never forget. You were not in that stage, in a phase of going outside the United States on a very voluntary basis and intervene everywhere in the world. After that, after the Second World War, suddenly you had two very strange wars, which you led in Korea and in Vietnam, which were very strange, which were Cold War, where you were not always that successful, but you thought that it was necessary in the policy of containment of communism to intervene there. But even, and the recent book has still shown it in a very clear way, not always, even in Korea, in the most successful way. And then suddenly, due to the weakness of Europe, we enter into the third phase of your external policy. Due to the weakness, you intervened in the Balkans War when the Europeans showed themselves totally incapable of solving the great humanitarian dramas, of the refugees on the European soil. So you see, slowly, the United States is changing its policy in a way where they say, now we have to be aware of our leadership role and we have to intervene in a more proactive way. And then, of course, the fourth stage, which is totally new for many, is, your intervention in Iraq, where there suddenly you took a much more proactive position, proactive situation, which is understood quite clearly because linked to 9/11, but in a totally new way of intervening in the world, And that's where, at the moment, between Europe and the United States, we have some difficulties to understand always the way you intervene. And I think for Americans also it's relatively difficult, even more than President Bush, when entering, his presidency, was in fact criticizing President Clinton to have intervened too much in the Balkans and was asking a non-interventionist policy. Did you listen carefully? President Bush in the beginning was favoring a non-interventionist policy. And suddenly the 9/11 drama, which is a much bigger trauma for you than for anybody else, because on that day you mentioned that you were entering into a war situation, and suddenly Europe was saying, we are not at war. That makes that now we face, in that situation, in the approach, of the post-9/11 trauma, we face a fundamentally different approach. And it's that different approach that we have to overbridge and which is critical for the future of the European-American relationship. We have to be honest and clear on that, and we all share the same final objective of making the world safer and better. But at the moment, and I'm going to enumerate a certain number of points where I feel there is a difference, and the first of these points is quite clearly, the threat evaluation we are making towards, terrorism. I'm not sure, that the threat evaluation of the Europeans, is as high as the threat evaluation of the Americans towards terrorism. For us, we consider it quite clearly, as a very dangerous phenomenon, but we have to fight against it by the word of fighting terrorism, where you are clearly saying the threat is that big that we have to declare us in a situation of war. Second difference, is then what type of answer do we have to give, to that type of threat? And there, and I can mention, my time here at NATO, the word which was most used by the United States within NATO was we have to provide for a global answer. So you want to give a global answer, trying to bring all the terrorist phenomena on the one hand, and even increasing the size of the terrorist threat in order to mobilize your own countrymen and your own strength and forces, where we are just looking more to more regional phenomena which have to be tackled by more regional or local approaches. We don't like the word global answer. Another thing, we want to fight, the terrorists in Afghanistan with a specific way. We want to fight them in Iraq in a different way. We want to fight them in Spain in another way, in UK in another way. There is for us more difficult to accept the idea of the concept of global war against terrorism. It is, a fight, but a fight where we want to limit, our response to the specificity of the threats in the different areas. Third, is what type of use of force are we entitled to do or not? And that is also, I think, somewhere a cultural difference between Europe and the United States at the moment. In your culture, and I respect it deeply, the use of force is more inborn, you have learned it, and I think it's part of your tradition of the conquest of the West. The use of force is an element which is natural, and you can relate it to the possession of arms and other things, where we, having suffered 10 centuries of internal fight, are a bit, fed up with the use of force, and we tend to diminish, the possibility of using force, and only limiting it to extreme cases. We do not like, to use force, too early at a certain stage. And that's why, at a certain stage, you have introduced the idea of preventive use of force, even when the danger is maybe not imminent. I'm going to refer to a certain number of principles of international law, which may be known by certain. But there you feel quite clearly at the moment, Europeans are reluctant to use force, and if they use force, it's soft power, where you are more inclined, at a certain stage, to teach the lessons to the other people and use more brutal force and other things. And I can refer there also to a debate, which we had at NATO at a certain stage in the fight against Taliban, where, between the Dutch, the Norwegian perm reps and the Americans, there was a clearly distinction and difference, where the American was saying, for my public opinion, I need to print every day on the front page that we kill Taliban, where, the European parliaments were asking, if we do it, don't publish it on the front page, because, our public opinion, our parliaments, have more difficulty in accepting it. I'm not defending one position or another here, I'm trying just to show the difference between, I see some already nodding their head and say, yes, no, I'm not here to defend Europe or to defend the United States. I'm just trying as a diplomat, and that will be my conclusion, what are at the moment, what I think, different approaches to solve a fundamental problem, how to run the world and how to improve the situation in the world, and the methodology each one is using. Another difference is also, it's that you are at the moment in the United States much more operational driven, and looking for deliverables, which is a point, I think, which deserves great admiration. The energy of your political system is always looking for results. It's something amazing. Whenever you speak, to United States politicians, they need deliverable and results on the following day. That means, whatever conference you go to, immediately, we receive discreetly a paper, we're saying the deliverables for the presidents of the United States for upcoming meeting are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Open your mouth, swallow them. Pure, thank you. Where we are more in a situation where we say, let's take time. Time could solve a certain number of problems, And a good example there at the moment, is the Kosovo issue, where, suddenly the Europeans, are less in a hurry, to find a solution, and where about 2 years ago, I felt, quite clearly, suddenly a decision taking, in the White House, National Security Council, State Department, we have now to solve that problem. It's enough. We are fed up with that problem. We have 17,000 American soldiers. Let's solve the problem. And that idea about solving the problem is, I think, a very generous idea, but it's not always an easy idea. Where the Europeans, let's say, let's have the situation rot a little bit more, and then slowly within 20, 30, 40 years, we can live with the division of Cyprus for 50 years if necessary, as long as they don't fight. Where you, at a certain stage, action-driven as you are not more going to find, the objective which you want to achieve, preferably before, the end of the presidency, so that the president can enter history by saying, I have achieved this, this, and this. On a certain way, at the moment, you feel quite clear. There was last week, at the speech of the president, about Cuba Libre. You felt quite clearly, God damn it, couldn't that chap dive quickly? Because, at least I would have a result, to show in my history books that Castro died during my presidency and other things. Which is, a clear image of result. And when he dies, let's make a revolution where Europeans, and at the moment, between the European diplomacy and the US diplomacy, there is a difference where, we called it freedom versus stability, where the Europeans say, we will need some change, but it's not necessary to do it through a revolution, where within the State Department you quite clearly feel, come on boys, the day he dies, let's make a revolution and clean all the mess of Cuba within 5 days in order, to install very quickly a democratic system. And you say, and once again, neither one or the other is right, it's just approaches, methodology, which differ under certain ways and other things. And finally, and I could go on a bit more, is at the moment, the idea in how far, is a nation entitled to interfere, in the internal politics of another state. You remember, that in the Treaty of Westphalia, and sorry to go back, to old European history, in fact, one of the basic principles of international law was the non-interference in the internal affair of a third state. There also we live now in a total evolution, which went, at the first stage to we have an obligation of humanitarian intervention if a government is not taking care properly about its own citizens. But now some are developing a more aggressive type of interference, in internal affairs. If there is a dictatorship somewhere, if a government is not based on the basic values we share about democracy, liberalism, and entrepreneurship, there is also a moral obligation, to try to change the regime in these governments. And that creates a lot of tension at the moment, where some feel that the United States is maybe too aggressive in its policy of changing some regimes, where other Europeans will say, no, we have to respect the regime, and let's work bottom up, hoping, that the revolution will come from bottom up and other things. A recent example was there, about what was happening in Belarus, where systematically, the United States was more actively involved in changing the regime, and I can understand it, because it's an ugly regime, at this stage. But others were saying, no, we can't do that. We cannot finance a certain number of opposition groups. We cannot infiltrate a certain number of groups. We cannot create through free television, an upheaval within the government and such a thing. And there you see, in all these things, you feel a difference between, an American approach, a US approach, and a more conservative, some will say, European approach. The final difference is, of course, is what place should all these international organizations play in, that new world. And there, there is, that you feel it also immediately, there is a difference, between the world architectural structure as we see it and, the United States see it. There we have to see quite clearly that the approach we have towards the United Nations is slightly different. For us, the United Nations remain the cornerstone of international peace and security. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 are for us a permanent reference for everything we do in the world. That brings me also back, to the famous 15th of February, where we were discussing within NATO, and where, I had to oppose, and it was done in the most friendly way, and Nick Burns became really a great friend. We were fighting for 12 hours to know if within, a small text of NATO regarding, and sorry, the technicality, the precautionary measures in favor of Turkey just on the eve of the attack against Iraq, we had to use the word UN in a NATO text or not. And I was under instruction, you are not going to leave the room without reference to the UN in the text. And the Americans go to the hell, bullshit, we are not interested in that word, we throw it outside another day. We had to fight 12 hours. But you may find it, stupid, but it reveals, a much deeper approach in the world problems and a more theoretical approach, on the one side and on the other side, where, the theoretical mentioning of the United Nations, even if we know their weaknesses, is for us important for our public opinion. Second is the role of NATO. NATO also, we face there, within the institution, and I had a heavy discussion about it. Is NATO subordinated or not to the UN? I was always mentioning, that we have 5 references to the UN Charter, in the Atlantic Treaty, and the United States will say there is no way that NATO is subordinated, to the UN. And others say it's the word subordination is bad, we know that NATO is not seeing itself as a regional institution according to, Chapter 8, but somewhere NATO cannot act outside the framework of the United Nations. Because even in case of attack, we are free to respond automatically, but it's referring automatically to Article 52 of the UN Charter, we say that automatically if a country is attacked, it has the freedom to attack. But you see there also, all these discussions are very important because that's what is going to shape the world. And last phenomenon, of course, which is extremely important, is for us and for you also the emergence, of the European Union as political player on the world scene. And there also we have to find between the United States and Europe, a constructive approach between the two. It's a very difficult one because we had a period in the United States, and I can refer to Eisenhower and Kennedy, who were heavily supporting, the European Union, and where later on you could detect, with a few presidents, an idea, let's have a divided Europe. It's more easy for us, United States, to play the British against the French against the German and other things. But as you heard, the evolution of the European Union becoming from a coal and steel institution now an emergent political power is, I think, also for the United States extremely important because at least you will have a solid partner on the other side of the Atlantic. You are not served by a weak Europe, The whole European history was a history of fighting of all these nations together. And I think, it's much better for you to have a united Europe where, first of all, you don't have to come to create peace every 50 years and to have and to rely on us, as a definite partner, in the future world. So if I may summarize, and that is, the emergence, of the United States, which at a certain stage could have the idea to remain a unilateral power and to decide everything themselves. And there I think you have to realize that, even as strong as you are, it is totally impossible, for a nation, to lead the world on its own. We are entering in a very complex world where everybody, has to accept that complexity and to accept that to make some progress, we will have to accept 2 or 3 basic principles. I think the first one is the multipolarity of the world. You feel quite well at the moment that the world is growing according to a certain number of big poles, which may be dangerous also because, it was the multipolar world before the First World War, which was at the basis, of one of the worst wars in human history, the First World War. Because if you have 5 or 6 big powers which have in a certain way the same weight and the same game of nations among themselves, one small error can create a certain number of conflicts among the main world powers. And it's quite clear at the moment that the main world powers are the United States, Russia, China, India, and the European Union. These are at the moment, Brazil may come up, but still not at this stage. But we have to accept somewhere the idea of that multipolar world, even if the United States remain the most powerful. But be careful, more and more you're projecting your strength only through military way and less through economic ways or moral ways. So that is an evolution in your history which is extremely important, and in my eyes detrimental. A nation is not strong to its military strength, but its strength, to its political, economic, and cultural strength. What the people in Afghanistan are looking for are not military soldiers, but they are looking for laptops, Blackberries, Coca-Cola, and jeans. That is your strength. Never forget that your cultural production is far more important than any soldier, on the soil. What the world wants is your type of life, is your type of living, it's McDonald's and other things, Be aware of that. The people abroad are not waiting soldiers, they are waiting water, electricity, and all the facilities you have. So first, acceptive of a multipolar world. Second, and a strong believing in international institutions. You may know they are weak, it's possible they are weak, but there is no evolution in the world without strong multilateral institutions. And the day you stop with multilateral institutions, and we had it already with the League of Nations, automatically you create the conditions, of war. So please remain strong members of the Security Council and never criticize too much the United Nations. It's the only element of world government which is still functioning with all its problems, with all its weaknesses, but there is no world without multilateral institutions. And within this multipolar world and that multilateral world, the basic evolution should be a strong partnership between Europe and the United States. It's quite clear, that the challenge we are going to face, with the growing strength of China, the growth of the population abroad, only a very solid transatlantic relationship, is the key. So we should avoid whatever differences we are. We should talk together, trying, to eliminate and diminish, a certain points I have shown, which each time were strengths and weaknesses of the system. None was better than the other, in order to create a solid transatlantic relationship. When I arrived here, I went to see Ben Scowcroft, which is one of the wise men you asked, and I asked him immediately, what is the most important issue in your eyes regarding foreign diplomacy? He answers was quite clear, transatlantic relationships. And that is only through a solid Europe and a solid United States. So these are a few questions which brought me much further, than the relationship between Belgium. But Belgium, is that small country within the European Union trying to consolidate the European Union and creating, that solid relationship between Europe and the United States. And I think for the one who have the time, the speech of Sarkozy yesterday in front of, the Congress was, I think, a very positive speech because, instead of insisting on the differences, he insisted permanently also, we have to do things together. Il faut faire les choses ensemble, l'entente, another thing. And that is, I think, the clear message. Do not exaggerate the differences. Let's build, on what we have in common. And we have a lot of common values and a lot of common objectives. But we have to do it, in a spirit of partnership, trying to eliminate the differences and to understand each other better in order to face the big new challenges of the 21st century, which probably will be trade, energy, environment, and peace as such. So thank you very much. So now I'm open for all questions. I was announced that there would be 2,500 questions. So, yeah, who is going to direct?
You direct questions.
Yeah, but you decide who asks the question. Oh my goodness! So I'm always starting with a nice girl.
My name is Jody Jensen, and I'm from Alpine, Utah. I'm studying sociology, and my question was, I lived in Belgium actually for 1.5 years, and a lot of what I saw when I was living in Wallonia was that a disproportionate amount of the tax dollars goes to the Wallons and comes from the Flemish. That's kind of just what I noticed. And my question for you is, with the decentralization of the government, will there be any sort of economic ramifications for the Wallons?
Yeah, I think you are referring to a part of history, and which make that in the original industrial time, the Walloon part of Belgium, the French-speaking part of Belgium, was the most wealthy, But through the industrial crisis linked to coal and steel, Wallonia faced a bit what Detroit and other area, industrialized areas faced, was a slowdown and a real crisis. At the same time, the Flemish part, which was very agricultural, through the acquisition and the investment in new technology, made, faced a much improved situation, so that, as you say, the image, is that at the moment the Flemish part is the richest part and the Walloon party is the poorest part. And that's why, all the Flemish, have that idea that they're paying, for a Volkswagen for each Walloon each year. It's a symbolic image that, their taxation is there to support the whole Walloon economy. And that's why the difference is in such a way that now the Flemish think, it's time, that our taxes remain more in my part, and don't go that much to the other part. One of the reasons why the Walloon, and now I'm going to enter into, and I hope there are no Belgian journalists, didn't improve that much. The girl from Antwerp is smiling, so okay, she's looking at me, with critical eyes, is that, the Walloon part of the region was run by a socialist government since 1945. And the Socialist Party in Belgium, and that is a policy which I respect, is only insisting on social welfare and improve the social facilities, of their citizens, which means that they increased unemployment fees, they increased everything what the state could do for the private citizen. The Flemish, on the other side, decided, to follow a more liberal track, a more entrepreneurship track, and saying, the state shouldn't take care of everything. Let's have the state providing basic, social security, but you should also leave the people who are rich become richer and pay for a certain number of social facilities themselves and other things. And it's that difference which is only reflected, in cultural terms now saying the Flemish speaking are against the French speaking. It's much more a question, of a political approach between a more social type of government, who was extremely negatively conservative in saying, we always have to protect our citizens, where, the Flemish part, try to influence a certain type of dynamism in society and say the citizens have to take more their responsibility in their own hands. And now the Flemish are trying to convince the Walloon and saying, the day you will take care of yourself, you will make more improvement because you will not have, a kind of jackpot which each year is coming down in your hands, and stopping the jackpot mentality, saying, we can rely on the Flemish taxation, will definitely create, within the Walloon part now, a much more dynamic approach of the problem. And already now, I can tell you that I see it, the most recent investment, of Google is now made in the Walloon part because the Walloon have understood that they have to support creative industries coming into the Walloon part, and that maybe the people will not have to work 6.5 hours, but 7.5 hours, and that their salary cannot increase on a permanent basis because they have to compare it, with salaries given in China and other places, so that there is quite clear, and you find it quite clear in the recent book of, Greenspan, The Age of Turbulence, where he say, if Europe wants to survive, it will have to be more critical towards its own social system. We cannot remain competitive in the world if we go on, with the social system we have at the moment. So we need a rebalance globally within Europe compared with the rest of the world, and in Belgium between the Flemish and the Walloon, where we change a little bit I would quote even the exaggeration of the social security system in Belgium. When in Belgium, I was starting another speech, somewhere else saying, when you speak about security, you think terrorism. When a Belgian speaks about the word security, he only thinks about his social security and the road security. That's the only, if you ask a Walloon chap what is security, he will say my social security. You ask in America what is your security, he will say the terrorist threats. You see what the difference are between the two cultures at the moment. Okay? So the man who first asked that question there, and
my name is Jason Harrington. I'm from Modesto, California. I'm a senior studying political science. And my question is, as Belgium goes through this decentralization and reorganization, what do you see as the key for maintaining stability in the nation in the absence of a sitting government, and in addressing your comments to the working together idea, what do you see the role of the United States as being in this situation?
Please stay outside, you don't understand anything, and the worst thing which could do is that the United States interfere in that political situation. It's above your pay grade. No, but it's a very good question. I hope in the end, having a certain number of common sense, and the word common sense in the United States, means a lot, because if I'm well informed, one of the books which inspired most, the United States was a book called Common Sense, is that in the end, the two cultural entities will recognize their differences, will accept that, they evolve on their own track, exactly, and I was this morning talking, to the president of the Senate here of Utah, also, if the central government in Washington don't take a certain number of measures, let the local government take the measure. Let each of the two countries, have their own government. It's not exceptional. In the United States, you have approximately a constitution in each state. You have a Senate in each state. You have, a Congress, a House in each state. So having that also in Belgium is not. They have simply to accept the differences with a terrible problem, and that is something you will never understand. The Walloon refusing to learn Dutch have imposed a border, a linguistic border, which is, you know, the cultural division. But you know, each Belgian wanting to have a house was also looking where is the cheapest piece of ground I could buy. And so then suddenly a lot of Walloon decided, but the soil, the ground is cheaper in the Flemish part. So let's buy, you know, a piece of ground there. And now they are there, they say, but you know, we want also the public administration to be done, you know, in that language, which is a bit difficult, you know, when you change from one side of the border to another side of the border, you would have to accept that the local language here, if a Mexican come here, he has to accept that, you know, the administrative language of the United States is English. And I'll say, so the Flemish expect the Walloon, when they cross the border to build a house because the ground was cheaper, that they accept the language. Now, the Flemish have difficulty in accepting the idea of a cultural minority within their own soil. You know, which is a basic right within Europe, is the recognition of cultural minorities. Because in Europe, you know, everybody has been moving and all that. But that the Flemish say, no, once you come on the Flemish soil, you know, you have to consider yourself Flemish, and you can't have a school in French or, you know, caretaking, you know, in French and other things. So you see how difficult. I think the most solid element, solidifying element in Belgium, I hope, there was always quoted three: the dynasty, the public debt, and Brussels. Bon, with all sympathy, and I think that the people who are doing the utmost best to keep Belgium together is the king, and it's a symbol because they are neither Flemish or Walloon, you know. But you know, if suddenly there is a republic coming, you send the king home with a pension, and the problem is solved, you know. Public debt is not too difficult to solve because, you know, if there is a population degree of difference between 60% Flemish and 40% Walloon, you split up the public debt between 60 and 40, that's easy. Brussels is the real asset of these two countries because everybody pretends that Brussels is its own capital. So, you know, making from Brussels a Washington, D.C. will be extremely difficult because both cultural entities decided that Brussels is as much a Flemish as a French-speaking town and others. So, and Brussels being the symbol, you know, of Europe, I hope that in the end, through a Belgian compromise, which nobody will understand, and that's good, you know, I say, you know, to the new ambassador, your ambassador to Brussels, Sam Fox, Belgium is a surrealistic country. Don't try to understand it, try to enjoy it. Drink your beer, eat your chocolate every day, but don't interfere in the politics and you will be happy. So, but sooner or later, our common sense, I hope, will survive, and you will read one day in the paper that we have a government which will be an extremely complex government composed by as many Flemish as Walloon, because we can have the former prime minister, whom was his diplomatic advisor, decided we could never have more than 15 ministers. The prime minister is asexual. You know, that's the word we use. He's neither Flemish or Walloon. You know, he's an asexual person. And there are 7 Flemish ministers and 7 Walloon ministers. So, but already the words we're using, you know, is something nobody understands in the world. You know, when the king refused to sign a law, he was declared mentally ill for 24 hours. And then the government signed the law and he was reinstalled as king. Unique, that's Belgium. But that makes it one of the most enjoyable countries in the world, where everybody, and yeah, she disappeared already for her lunch. You know, she must have Belgian habits, you know, going for the lunch. You know, everybody who comes to Belgium, believe me, find it a splendid country with a great cultural heritage, where living is splendid, climate is not that good, but where, you know, where people respect each other. But the politician likes to play games which the citizens are not always following. That I can believe you. There is no fight and there is no death in the Belgium, you know, struggle for recognition since, I think, 75 years, where one people was on the street was hurt by a horse, that's the last death we had, you know, in our cultural revolutions in Belgium, and that was, I think, 46 or 47 years ago. So we all go together to the same soccer matches. We compete, you know, in the same competition for soccer, basketball, but not on baseball and football, because that's totally ignored in Belgium. There are 2 sports you still have to import. A good mission for your ambassador to import these sports. Yeah, as many as you want. I can stay until 3 o'clock. Yes, okay, the first one there with his hat.
Hi, thank you for your comments today. I lived in Brussels on September 11th, 2001, and I was very warmly surprised by the extreme outpour of love and support. And I also lived in Brussels about a year later when America was going into Iraq, and I witnessed a tidal shift in the public consensus towards America. And I thought your comments today were very enlightening on how these differences of opinions really are the result of differences in cultural background. So my question is, what can be done to increase the understanding of the cultural background behind these differences so that we don't simply view Europe as either with us or against us, but we understand why they take the positions they do?
But you know, I think my answer there is very clear, and you are a superb example for that, you know, having far more Americans going to Europe, you know, and I think here your university is investing heavily in number of students studying to Belgium, you know, and far more Belgium coming to study in the United States. All Belgium coming to the United States are happy. I had 2 nieces coming to have 1 year, you know, at schools in the United States. They have an American flag in their room. And I think all Americans coming to Europe are also fascinated to what Europe is. So let's have simply the younger guys, you know, having a lot of exchange program between them. We had that fantastic program of Europe, Erasmus, where now most of the university students can spend 6 months, you know, in another university during their 5 or 4 years. That means, you know, each Belgian student at the moment approximately has the chance to go to a Spanish university, to an Italian university, to an Irish university, and they learn to appreciate the other country. You know, it would be fantastic, you know, if there were here among you, you know, 25 who could spend 1 year in Europe at the university, and if in exchange you would have 25 Europeans here. That would be great. And that is the best way, you know, to bring people together, is to bring the youth together, you know, and having studying in each other country. That's my very simple answer. And here, you know, your university is a good example, you know, and whatever, you know, Belgium, you know, is exchange program, learning foreign languages, investing in that type of teaching. My answer there is quite clear. Yeah, one more before we all go to lunch.
My name is Matt Johnson. I'm from Melba, Idaho, and I'm an international relations major. I just have a quick question. You mentioned that in the United States there's a feeling of being driven by results, and I'm just wondering about the European Union, if there's a sense of urgency in Europe to create a unified European Union and get that accomplished soon.
That's a very, very good and solid question, because I think there you are touching one of the most basic differences, you know, and difficulties Europe is facing. We are known as the Ayatollahs of the European integration, maybe to solve our own problem. We are, and the book my Prime Minister wrote is the United States of Europe. But abandoning a certain type of nationalism, you know, as for UK, France and Germany, is extremely difficult, you know. They have all somewhere, you know, and I hope there are no representatives named, they all suffer from the syndrome of lost empires. They cannot accept that they are not that more important. So the biggest service you could render Europe, but that's difficult for you also, is to tell them, you know, that from now on you will only have 1 seat in the Security Council, and that is the European Union sitting as there, and asking the French and the English to leave their seat and to promote Europe. The day you're doing that, you know, you would render humanity one of the greatest service. But it's difficult for the British to lose, you know, the impression that they are still powerful and influential, although they have nothing to say anymore in the world. But they should realize it. At least we realize it. The French don't realize it, but they have to learn to live as normal state. They are smaller than most of your states here, you know. You have to realize that, you know. California is much more powerful than is the UK or France. So they have to realize also that being a partner in a multilateral sphere suppose also that you can learn to integrate into a union where you can have a full respect of the diversity. You know, I see the American, you all say I'm from Texas, I'm from California, I'm from Boston and other thing. Go to the Swiss cantons. They all are Swiss, but the first thing they say, we're a member of that canton. I have no problem in keeping, you know, your cultural identity. The Swedish keep it perfectly, but believe also in European integration at a certain stage. So having a global government for Europe, you know, would be a fantastic improvement, you know, for world stability and world good governments. But you have to push them, you know, one more point where the American push the European to tell them, we don't want only 1 seat for Europe in the Security Council. The day I hear that in the mouth of a US president, it will be a great day for the United States. But I don't think, you know, they are daring to say it because they want to keep their special privileged relationship with these poor British. Sorry to end on an ironic note.